down. My name is Mark Hughes, and I am the co-faculty director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at the Weitzman School of Design, the privileged stewards of this magnificent room and all the other rooms in this hallowed tower at the very heart of campus. No one ever doubts the standing of energy policy at Penn, that we are here in this incredible space. And the banners that you saw as you walked up the monumental staircase record a truly distinguished legacy now of recipients of the Carnot Prize for distinguished contributions to energy policy, never more so than this year and this recipient. We are so pleased to add Ramón Méndez Galain's name to that amazing wall. So now, during his tenure, Ramón transitioned Uruguay away from energy insecurity, volatility, and harm toward energy stability, prosperity, and health. In contrast to its neighbors, Uruguay lacks fossil resources, and prior to the reforms, its electricity sector depended primarily on fossil fuel from Argentina. It was not only costly, but precarious. And in 2008, Uruguay's suppliers halted the supply of liquid fuels, causing a regional energy crisis. Ramón made very real the overused aphorism of never waste a crisis, combining in equal parts the skill of the physicist and the politician, equally adept at herding catalysis as cats. He created the conditions that made Uruguay one of the most electrified countries in the Western Hemisphere, where nearly all homes are connected to a grid approaching 100% clean electricity. Ramón's policy design in Uruguay was national in scale, economy-wide in scope, and aggressive in pace. In other words, his approach did not dither in the face of transition, but rather moved quickly and in concert across all sectors of Uruguayan society to minimize costs and accelerate benefits. This energy transition attracted investments of more than $5 billion, 10% of the national GDP. It reduced electricity generation costs by 40% and significantly increased employment, largely through an offset of public sector fossil energy jobs replaced with private sector renewable clean energy jobs. Uruguay is one of 3 nations chosen by the UN's International Labor Organization to demonstrate new just transition guidelines, perhaps the most complex and difficult conversation that can operate at a national scale around the energy transition. See the United States. As we know, changes in energy drive changes in the environment and in the economy. Uruguay's carbon emissions peaked in 2012, 4 years after the reforms were passed. Emissions have decreased 21% since, and Uruguay is on its way to carbon neutrality by the year 2030. Uruguay also has the lowest poverty rate in Latin America, and its poverty rate has been declining since 2006. Today, it's less than 10% of the total population, well below the US level. National circumstances differ, apples, oranges, bananas, but as fruit, they all have things in common. And one of the things that nations have in common is that visionary leadership can make change. And that's what we celebrate each year in the Carnot Prize, never better illustrated than with Ramón. Before I hand over the mic to our beloved Dean Fritz Steiner, I want to quickly acknowledge some people in the audience today who are not listed in the program. I'd like to welcome Scott Kleinman, whose generous gifts brought the center to life, including his latest, which provides for new center space across the street in Weitzman Hall, and is named in honor of Fritz, which makes me so happy. I also welcome Ramón's family members, his wife, daughter, mother, and nephew who have traveled to be together for this event. You know what? Stop counting your steps. Nobody's getting enough exercise until they have tried to keep up with Ramón's mother at lunchtime in the Reading Terminal Market. which is what I was trying to do just today. And so I'm paying a little more attention to my script than I usually would as I try to recover. And then also here in the front row, actually in the second row, we welcome Noah Gallagher Shannon, the author of a New York Times Magazine story last year about Uruguay's larger sustainability efforts. Noah's story caught our attention and imagination as we approached Ramón for this year's prize. Do we have a slide on that? It's a fantastic story that I would invite you all to look back on. And we hope you'll tune in to our Energy Policy Now podcast later this month, recorded today, which will feature Noah and Ramón in conversation. We also have the former dean of the engineering school, Eduardo Glant, more on him later, as I introduce later the faculty lecturer this year. And finally, it is a personal joy to welcome Professor Sonia Carli, there she is, to Penn, faculty co-director of the Kleinman Center this year and assuming the full role in the summer of 2024. It's now my privilege to turn the microphone over to Dean and Paley Professor Fritz Steiner.
Thank you, Mark. On behalf of the entire faculty, staff, and student body of the Weitzman School of Design, welcome. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and many new faces here today. I know there are many other commitments and opportunities competing for your time, but your being here tells me that those of us who work in the built environment professions, we understand that there's no time to waste in combating climate change. Looking around this room, we can see also that many allies outside the built environment professions. The clean energy transition is undoubtedly the greatest challenge our species has ever faced. It's going to take a lot of creativity. It's going to take discipline and courage, all that we can muster. But we are, after all, an amazingly adaptive species, maybe for better and for worse, the most adaptable species. When it comes to adaptation, we have much to learn from visionary leaders like Ramón Méndez Galain. And what a vision he had, as Mark has laid out. Ramón's energy transition blueprint had rippling effects that not only changed the power sector, but also the national economy and political stability of his country. And did we mention his proposed energy plan was approved by all the country's political parties? That's a vision supported by superhuman diplomatic skills. Speaking of diplomatic and visionary leaders, we're lucky to have with us today Penn's 9th president, Liz McGill, the trustees, university professor, and professor of law. She joined Penn after serving as the Richard E. Lang Professor and Dean of the Stanford Law School, and as Executive Vice President and Provost at the University of Virginia. President McGill has brought transformational changes both to both of those institutions, and is well on her way to do the same here at Penn. So please welcome President McGill.
Well, it is wonderful to see all of you today. Thank you, Dean Steiner, for that warm welcome. I too want to welcome Scott Kleinman and thank him for his leadership and visionary support. And thank you, Professor Mark Allen Hughes. As founding faculty director, you have made the Kleinman Center a destination for urgent issues related to climate change and working on and contributing to the move to a just and efficient energy system. Just a small assignment that you've taken on. The center's contributions to sustainability and interdisciplinary connection at Penn are really very singular. The research the center supports ranges from electricity to equity, and it turns its full attention to the future. That future is both daunting and bright. As an academic institution, this university, I think like all universities, are directed toward the future. We are educating the rising generation. We are creating knowledge for those who come after us to both use and improve. At Penn, this orientation toward the future, this orientation toward tomorrow, is inseparable from action on energy. We also believe here, and we're going to get a very good example today, we believe that change is possible, not only necessary, but possible. And the winner of this year's Carnot Prize has proven it. Ramón Méndez Galain has built a career turning crisis to consensus. He helped create an alternate course for Uruguay, one focused on shared solutions and the common future of the people in the country. At the turn of the 21st century, the country had hit a crisis point in energy. Oil accounted for nearly a third of its imports. A costly pipeline was in the works, yet there was dwindling supply, and hydroelectric power plants were limited by drought. Many have noted that the answer to our global climate crisis lies in our capacity to imagine. Dr. Méndez's leap of imagination and his ability to share that vision with others has resulted in one of the most striking decarbonization stories on planet Earth. As National Director of Energy and then of Climate Change, he worked across the political spectrum, as has already been mentioned. He united left and right. Perhaps your next assignment could be in the United States, to diversify energy supplies between wind, solar, biomass, and water. He somehow did this while ensuring consistency and well-being for the people he served, loosening the country's finances from fluctuating energy commodity prices and radically cutting costs. Today, as Professor Hughes noted, almost all energy in Uruguay comes from renewables. Poverty has plummeted, and tens of thousands of new jobs have been created. A professor of physics, Dr. Méndez entered the political arena with a mindset that was obviously scientific, but also social. He married technical precision to ethical, environmental, and cultural priorities. This approach has made him a national caretaker and an invaluable global leader. He not only inspires others to decarbonize, he's actively assisting as the CEO of the Ivy Association, an organization that supports the energy transition across Latin America. Dr. Méndez has taught us that the status quo is not built for the future we need. Today, we gather to applaud his consensus-building leadership, which shows us that change is not simply going to happen. It has to be imaginatively created. So please join me in congratulating Ramón Méndez Galain, the 2023 recipient of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy's Carnot Prize. Officially bestowing the prize.
Yes, really. What a incredible. It's even better than you see in the picture. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
We're gonna go sit so we can hear you. Oh, okay, gosh, apparently it didn't happen unless we.
Yes,
President McKeel, Mark, Dean, dear professors, dear members of the UPenn academic community, dear family, thank you very much. It is an honor to me to be with you this evening in this magnificent building, as Mark was saying. To be invited by this prestigious university as a special guest to receive such a relevant recognition as the Carnot Award for the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy is something that I never imagined in my life. I'm very proud of having my name in the list of extraordinary women and men that have been recognized with this prestigious prize. Coming here remind me of the early years of my professional life when I was a scientist, a particle physicist, a university professor like many of you, trying to help to understand something as far away as the daily life as the physics of the first microsecond of the universe after Big Bang. And I was very happy doing that. That allowed me to work in prestigious research centers in Europe, Latin America, and even here in the States, interacting with remarkable colleagues that taught me a lot. I really enjoyed the freedom that academic life gives us, the freedom to think, to imagine, to make mistakes, and to start again with the same conviction as before. But a little over 15 years ago, when I was a professor at the University in Montevideo, Uruguay's energy sector was going through a deep crisis. The country's economy was growing at incredible rates, and poverty was decreasing, which was very good, of course, but energy consumption was growing rapidly. Uruguay has no reserves of fossil fuels. We have already used our large rivers to install hydropower plants, and our two big neighbors, Argentina and Brazil, were having serious difficulty to supply their domestic demand, so it was not easy for them to assist us. In dry years, mainly caused by El Niño phenomena, we have to use much more imported fuels, or we were forced to import electricity from our neighbors at extraordinary prices. In those years, cost overruns could exceed $1 billion. And for a small economy like Uruguay, this is 2% of its GDP. And even then, it was sometimes difficult to meet such a rapidly growing demand. So we were beginning to have supply problems. In that difficult national energy context, I saw the need to get involved in the search for solutions. What I had to do was what we scientists are trained to do: face a complex problem and come up with an original solution. So I decided to reinvent myself. I began to study the energy problem and to discuss with different national and foreign experts. I rapidly understood how complex the energy problem is, how many dimensions it has: technological, economical, of course, but also geopolitical, environmental, social, cultural, and even ethical dimensions. After some months, I started to write down my thoughts. And almost without realizing it, I ended up with a holistic proposal focused on a just transition to renewable energies with very ambitious goals. And one day, when I was with a graduate student at my office in university, I received an unexpected call. My proposal had reached the president, and he was inviting me to implement it. Yes, the president was proposing me, a theoretical physicist, to be the political head of the National Energy Agency of my country, what in the United States would be a Secretary of Energy. And I did something crazy. I accepted. We immediately began to implement those ideas. But before the full result could be seen, there was an election. Fortunately, the new president, Jose Pepe Mujica, supported what we had started, and he asked me to remain in office. But he insisted that the policy should be accepted and shared by all political parties. Patiently, we negotiated with all parties represented in parliament, and after accepting some minor changes, we achieved our goal. Having a long-term policy backed by the entire Uruguayan political system was fundamental to make rapid progresses. In just 5 years, Uruguay went from a traditional hydrothermal power mix with up to 50% fossil fuels to an almost completely decarbonized mix that already in 2017, 6 years ago, was 98% renewable. But what makes the Uruguayan case unique is that nearly half of that electricity is generated from non-traditional renewable sources, wind, solar, and sustainable biomass. Wind alone can produce up to 40% of the total electricity consumed in the country in a year, a percentage comparable to the other world wind champion, Denmark. But also 15 or even 20% of electricity is produced using sustainable biomass. Uruguay is an agri-industrial country with abundant organic waste, with high energy content, like rice hulls, bagasse, black liquor from pulp mills, which have now ceased to be an environmental liability to become an energy asset. Of course, this was not easy. We have to innovate. We have to understand how to plan, how to operate a system very different from the traditional ones. Our academics worked for years to design a groundbreaking software, stochastic software, to handle energy dispatch, specifically designed to manage intermittent sources such as wind and sun, but also how to use water. This model uses the probability of occurrence of different weather scenarios based both on a century of historical data and resource forecasting. This allows us, for example, to have a prediction of wind and solar generation up to a week in advance. And this allows us to know how and when we have to use water from the dams. Thanks to this disruptive methodology, today in Uruguay, intermittent sources are king. The total installed capacity of wind plus solars is of the order of the total country's peak demand. This means that when we have enough sun and wind, almost all the electricity is generated just from these two sources, in addition to biomass-fired thermal plants. And this can happen at many times during the course of a week. At that time, we don't use the dams. Hydroelectric plants only come into play when the sun goes down or when the wind falls. Our insurance policy, because we have an insurance policy, when all else fails, is gas turbines and combined cycle plants, along with engine power plants. Yes, of course, flexible fossil fuel power plants remain there. But we have to use them very little over the course of a year, allowing non-renewable sources to account for no more than 2% of electricity consumed in the country in a regular year, and as much as 6 or perhaps 7% in a very dry one. And we achieve this without any single battery storage, water pumping, or modern technological solution for electricity storage. Yes, Uruguay has proved that a power system can work almost exclusively thanks to the complementarity of different renewable sources, regardless of their individual intermittency. And what about the economy? How much did all this cost? Well, this transformation had no cost. On the contrary, it produced an impressive positive impact to our economy. To begin with, the total cost of generating electricity consumed by the country was reduced by almost half. We went from about $1.1 billion a year to only $6 billion today. Those $500 million cost reduction every year for a country like Uruguay is enormous, since it is equivalent to 1% of its GDP. Just for comparison, as you know, 1% of United States GDP is about $250 billion. One can use another figure to see the impact. We went from about 10 cents per kilowatt hour as the average generation cost to no more than 5 after the transition. Moreover, those tremendous cost overruns associated with dry years, well, they virtually disappeared. We went from cost overruns of $1 billion to only 100 or 200 million today. Yes, surprisingly enough, we have now much more natural sources in the mix, but thanks to their complementarity, we are much less dependent on weather variabilities. Achieving this tremendous cost reduction was not easy. We have to innovate also on that. We have to understand that renewable energies require a business model quite different from the traditional one on the electric sector. We have to design a new market model. Our current business model is based on long-term contracts derived from auction processes. The tricky point is that in these auctions, the percentage of each source is predetermined based on a system-wide optimization model that defines the best technical complementarity between sources. in order to minimize the overall cost of the system. The bidder submits to offer the best price technology per technology. This allows electricity generation to be almost 100% under contract, which naturally minimizes the spot market and also the uncertainty. The economic advantage of this new model is not only the decrease in the overall cost, but also its stability over time. Today, the cost of electricity generation in Uruguay is stabilized, as it is almost independent on fluctuation in energy commodity prices. This is why Uruguay's electric sector was barely affected by the tragic war in Europe. We had no supply or affordability difficulties. But economic benefits brought by the energy transition went far beyond the energy sector itself. We received $6 billion, 5, 6, something between, in a few years. And this is about 12% of our GDP. New knowledge, new industrial and entrepreneurial capacities were developed, and 50,000 new jobs were created. This may sound small for you, but in a country of only 3.4 million inhabitants, it represents about 3% of the labor force of the country. Again, if we were to make a comparison with the United States, it would equate to the creation of several million new jobs. When I tell people about what achieved in Uruguay, they often tell me that it was possible because Uruguay is a small country. Nothing could be farther from the truth. It is much more difficult for a small country in the global south to make big changes. Large economies have more financial possibilities, greater capacities to attract investment, more experts with better qualification as you, and large local manufacturing capacity. Many other people also think that what happened in Uruguay was possible because almost half of our electricity comes from hydro. No doubt, this is important, but it is not the most important thing. What really matters is the flexibility we give to our system so that all manageable sources, either hydro or fossil power fuel plant, all of them can filter the intermittency of wind and solar. Wind and solar have to rule because if we do the right things, they are the cheapest options today. So the higher their share, the lower the total cost of the system. Of course, doing this requires the system expansion planning, both generation and grid, to be very different from what is usually done today. Our present power systems all over the world have been designed with fossil fuel thermal generation in mind, where, for example, the variable cost of generation plays a central role. But the renewables technology business is very different. The fuel is free, and the operation maintenance costs are almost negligible. You must have to pay back the investment. That's it. It's a financial business. But the tricky point is that none of this is going to happen spontaneously. We cannot think that we will achieve the energy transition simply by adding more solar and wind power to our current grid. We need to create the conditions for a new type of system to develop. And the market alone cannot achieve this process. We need public policies that allow for this new planning and operation of the system with a view based on a global multidimensional optimization, not only on the individual economic optimization of each market agent. We need public policy that comprehensively address the design of the transition to build a complete transformative ecosystem. We need public policy defining a regulatory package that takes into account the disrupted characteristic that the power system needs in order to achieve high shares of intermittent sources. We need public policies that give clear signals to market players about the directions of the sector. For all this to happen, we need a strong political will to move forward. And to this end, it is highly advisable to build a broad political agreement that transcends the administration in office. Since I left the government, I've been supporting transition processes of many countries with very different energy and national circumstances. And the most interesting point is that in all of them, the Uruguayan model could work. Perhaps not all countries may reach 98% of renewables, but they could reduce the share of fossil fuels to below 20%. And as a first step, that wouldn't be a bad thing. So my most important message today is that renewable energies are no longer just a solution to the climate crisis. Today, they allow us to build secure, reliable, and robust energy system. They allow us to sharply reduce and stabilize the cost of electricity while having a huge positive impact on the economy and job creation. The Uruguayan example shows that the renewable energies are ripe to provide not only a climate solution on a global scale, but also substantial socioeconomic benefits at a national level. Before finishing my speech, please allow me to come back to more personal consideration. 15 years ago, when I accepted the responsibility to lead the national energy agency of my country, my life changed forever. I lost all my freedom as an academic. When you have a political position, you are much more restricted. You can say everything you think, and you often can't even think everything you want because even your thought could be overheard. But from the responsibility I took, I get the wonderful opportunity to bring about the changes my country needed. Yes, I lost my academic freedom, but I want the chance to change people's life, primarily with future generation in mind. So today, it is my turn to thanks. Of course, first of all, I would like again to offer my heartfelt thanks to the University of Pennsylvania, the Kleinman Center, its leadership, and its staff who decided to give me this fantastic recognition. Thank you for the award. Thank you for your hospitality, for your generosity, and thank you for allowing me to share these moments with an important part of my family. I still have one page to read. I don't know how to do it. But I do not take the Carnot Prize personally. I see this award as a recognition that you are given to what my country, Uruguay, has achieved. A recognition to a group of Uruguayans who made the so-called Uruguayan energy revolution possible. I see this award as a recognition that you are making to the relevance of success stories to show that another world is possible. And in this moment of acknowledgement, please allow me to thank my mother and my father, who I lost 30 years ago. But he's always in my life, and in them symbolically. I want to thank the generation that brought me here, that brought all of us here. I want to thank my wife for her love and support, and in her, symbolically, I want to thank life and the beautiful opportunity it offers me day after day. And finally, I want to thank the younger generation of my family, especially my daughter, Kata, because besides teaching me to be happier every day, she symbolically represents the future generations to whom I would like to beckon a better world than the one we received. Thank you very much.
Okay, Bill, you forgot the hankies. Thank you, Ramon. That was a lovely, lovely speech. So it is, sorry, it's our tradition at each Carnot ceremony to present a lecture in honor of the recipient. the very first lecture was a memorable 2 or 3 hour tour de force by former engineering dean Eduardo Plant. It was like being at the Royal Society that year when Newton, Boyle, and Wren were all in the same room. And today we have something just as special. And recognizing that only Eduardo might make 2023 feel like 1723. This time, our lecturer is going to do it all in just 30 minutes or so. For the first time, our Carnot lecture is being delivered by an alum of Penn's slightly ahead of its time graduate energy program from the 80s and 90s. After receiving his PhD from Penn, Roberto Schaefer went on to become one of the world's most influential and recognized energy scholars. Roberto is a professor of energy economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, which is the greatest name for a university ever. Rio de Janeiro in your university name, great marketing device. That's fantastic. Would love to go. And principal investigator for the Center for Energy and Environmental Economics. In 2022, he was elected a member of the Brazilian Academy of Science. He's made extraordinary contributions to the IPCC reports that have defined the climate and energy policy conversation for 2 decades. In fact, he has authored more IPCC reports than all but 7 scholars of the hundreds around the world who have contributed over the decades. Roberto has played pivotal roles in the development of the integrated assessment models, which we rely on to better understand Earth and human systems and their interaction, and without which we would be completely incapable of developing the policy options that we need to place in front of decision makers in order to confront the energy transition necessitated by climate change. Roberto has also been instrumental in establishing connections between global models and national analyses, not just in first world economies, but also in major developing countries. And through his efforts, the conversation has greatly broadened away from just the United States, North America, and Europe, but really has become a much more truly global conversation because of the capacities that Roberto has helped develop in nation after nation after nation. And today, his talk will, I'm deftly stepping up Bill's way. Today, his talk will focus on insights derived from this analysis for this conversation about, oh, thank you, about the role that models can play in facilitating a truly global energy transition. Roberto.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon. It's really a privilege for me to be here. As Mark said, I graduated from the old Energy Management and Policy program here at Penn back in 1990. Then I stayed for 2 more years as a visiting scholar here. So I left Penn exactly 30 years ago, 1993. And after that, I had the opportunity to come back a couple of times, including an invitation I received from the Kleinman Center back in 2016, when I spent a week here as a visiting scholar, but this time is different. So it's really an honor for me to be here. What I'm going to be discussing here is this issue about energy transitions and the role we should expect, or the world expects, from developing countries, or from the global north and the global south. Just to give some contextualization here, what's important to notice is that, let's say, with the Paris Agreement in 2015, basically all nations in the world were invited to voluntarily present their pledges to deal with climate change. This is very, let's say, bottom-up kind of approach. And somehow this bottom-up kind of approach is leading the energy transition all over the world including Latin America. So it's important to have this in mind. Climate change or climate mitigation is really what's behind the energy transition. We may have other reasons to have an energy transition, but basically climate change is the key issue here. Then it comes to this issue of fairness. Let's say, to what extent each individual country, let's say, pledging to do something is fair, and how to compare if what a specific country is pledging is fair as compared to what other countries are pledging. So this leads us to some equity principles, and we're going to be discussing this a little bit. Okay, so what we're going to be discussing here today in this less than 30 minutes mark, and no worries about that, is how, let's say, we can explore country-level emission targets and carbon budgets. Latin America is being pinpointed here, but I'm going to go beyond that and see what are the implications in terms of equity for each individual country in the world to give its contribution to deal with climate change. My presentation is split in 4 parts here. Very briefly, I'm going to present you what's the framework or the modeling framework behind the results I'm going to be showing here. I'm going to discuss a little bit, let's say, global mitigation pathways to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, ideally to 1.5 degrees. Briefly discuss different burden sharing schemes, let's say how different countries should share the burden of fighting climate change, and finally, some results of the presentation. Very briefly, what's the modeling framework I have here? As Mark said, in the past 20 years, let's say I built a group in Brazil where we began to build what is called integrated assessment models. No more than 20 groups in the world have this capability, and we're very proud to have this capability in Brazil. And basically what we have, let's say, is a series of models that comes from the global level and go down to the country level. And by having this both a global and national model, you can somehow, let's say, confront what's being done domestically and whether or not what each country is doing is enough, let's say, to fulfill the global objective of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. To do that, let's say we have developed a global integrated assessment model that we call coffee. And the reason to have this name here, I gave this name to our model because at that time, coffee was the major export product of Brazil. And I thought it would be emblematic to have a global model developed in Brazil which we could export to the rest of the world. This model splits the world in 18 regions, like Canada is one single region, US is a single region, Japan, India, South Africa, etc. And Brazil is one single region. South America is one single region. Central America is one single region. So by having this split, we can arrive at some very interesting conclusions, and I'm going to show you this later. Last year, the IPCC released its most recent report, the AR6 report, and I was one of the 2 lead authors of Chapter 3, which is the chapter on long-term mitigation pathways. And basically, we have collected from the literature more than 2,000 global mitigation scenarios. But because let's say, to try to give a picture of what 2,000 scenarios are saying, we decided to pick 5 emblematic scenarios, which we call illustrative mitigation pathways. And one of these 5 illustrative mitigation pathways was developed by my group using this coffee model. So basically, this model now is internationally recognized. I don't have time to go into details here, but basically, these 5 stories for the world to meet the 1.5 or 2 degree target are very much built behind this SP scenario, which is a sustainable kind of scenario, a LD, which is low demand scenario, a REN scenario, which is a renewable scenario, a GS, which is global strengthening scenario, and then this IMP neg, which is a scenario using our coffee model that relies heavily on negative emissions. It's not because we're defending negative emissions, but this is also a possibility with all the delays that we're seeing now to fight climate change. Chances are that we're going to, let's say, exceed the 1.5 degree target, eventually even exceed the 2 degree target. But by having negative emissions later on, chances are we're going to bring this temperature down again. So that's why this IMP-NEG is so representative. So this is the framework I'm going to be discussing here. What about 1.5 degree scenarios? What I'm going to be showing here, let's say, is what we call least cost solutions to deal with the climate change. What's the least cost solution? Let's say we're not very much concerned about where the mitigation will take place, provided that that mitigation is done at the least cost. It means that, let's say, if we're talking about carbon taxes, for example, that we're going to have the same carbon price all over the world, and basically, let's say, investors would decide to mitigate where it's cheaper. So it's not exactly a kind of fair principle to deal with the problem, but normally we use this as a framework or as a baseline to confront other possibilities of, let's say, sharing the burden of dealing with climate change with this least cost solution. The first thing that's interesting to see here, let's say, in this least cost solution for the globe, basically our model reaches net zero CO2 by 2060. In the case of Latin America and Brazil, let's focus on Latin America, we reach net zero CO2 by 2050. So we see here already something. Why we reach net zero CO2 in Latin America 10 years earlier than the rest of the globe? Because from the global point of view, it's cheaper to do that. It doesn't mean that it's cheaper for Uruguay, for Argentina, for Brazil, or for Colombia. So then we have a, let's say, a fairness issue here. Who is going to pay for that? How are we going to, let's say, transfer the funds to finance something in specific countries, which basically would be selling a service for the rest of the globe. So stick with this idea here because this is going to be very important later on. Climate change. When you talk about a 1.5 degree world or a 2 degree world, basically we're talking about a remaining carbon budget that we still have to spend up to the level of 1.5 or 2 degrees. So basically, why? Basically because once you burn a fossil fuel, the CO2 will remain in the atmosphere almost forever. Meaning that, let's say, there's nothing you can do once you have emitted that CO2. So we have a limited carbon budget, and basically you have to, let's say, to decide on how to share the effort to share that carbon budget among the different nations. In a least cost solution, okay, let's find the least cost solution, no matter where that abatement will take place. But again, some fairness considerations here. So when we look at this figure here, you see that Africa, Latin America, et cetera, in a least cost solution, we see the lowest possible budget, meaning that most of the effort will have to take place there in a least cost world. Who is going to pay for that? So this is the point I want to raise. So you see, let's say, the Asian Pacific, Anglo-America, Europe, et cetera, they receive a much larger budget because it's more expensive to mitigate there. And let's say the global south, because it's cheaper to abate that. Why is it cheaper to abate that? Many reasons. Because eventually you can use land-based solutions, let's say, to capture CO2, afforestation, reforestation, eventually because the infrastructure or the energy infrastructure in those countries is not ready yet. So if you want to build new infrastructure, it's cheaper to do something right from the beginning as opposed to adapt something that's already built. But critical issue, and just to give you the feeling how critical this issue is, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we're talking about a remaining carbon budget from today up to 2100 of roughly 300 gigatons of CO2. The world emits today 50 gigatons of CO2, meaning that we have 6 years to continue to emit at the level we emit today and basically shut down the world, turn off all the lights here, do something else. We're not going to make it. And that's why, let's say, when you run our model, this IMP-NEG scenario, we use 700 gigatons of CO2 up to 2050, although you only have a budget of 300. And that's why we have a temperature overshoot, and then we have to have negative emissions later on to compensate for that. So also a very emblematic situation here. Not going to go into details here, but basically what you see is that as of today, 80% of all primary energy in the world still relies on fossil fuels. In this least cost scenario for 1.5 degree world, we're going to need to be 40% dependent on fossil fuels by 2050. Renewables are going to grow from 50% today up to 50% by 2050, et cetera, et cetera. So big changes here. But when we move, let's say, from the globe as a whole, and you look at these same numbers individually, we see that, let's say, different countries will have to decarbonize much faster than other regions, simply because it's cheaper to do that, provided that the proper means to do that will be available. So in this scenario here, we see, let's say, basically US with a huge budget, and then you see the, let's say, fossil fuels is still playing a role in the US or in Europe. And then when you look at, let's say, in the global south, you see much more, let's say, renewables to be able to do that. So again, let's say, it's not exactly a fair share on how to distribute the budget, but it's the least cost solution, and we're going to discuss this a little bit later. When you look at Latin America, fossil fuels represent 75% of all primary energy today, and you're going to go down to 35% by 2050, meaning that, let's say, Latin America will decarbonize faster than the rest of the world. Wind, solar, hydro play major roles. Uruguay, again, a good example for that. What about, let's say, land use and biofuels? This is also interesting. When you talk about, let's say, the climate issue, we're not talking about energy only. Let's say energy only, when you talk about climate change, is very much a kind of Eurocentric view of the world, or an American view of the world. In many developing countries, energy is not the issue. Land use is the issue, either because of deforestation, either because of agriculture, N2O, methane emissions. So talking about climate change is talking about energy plus many other sectors of the economy. And in fact, let's say, global cropland is expected to be multiplied by 4 times by 2050, because the global south basically is the region which already and in the future will feed the world. And then we have this conflict with land use, how you can feed the world and at the same time rely more on renewables, biofuels. So some tensions here, but let's say this can happen. And our model basically sees that, let's say, food production will need to move to more productive areas in order to release areas for example, renewable energy to become more important. Again, not going to go into details here, but basically we see that the share of biofuels in general will increase in the world, in particular in the global south. What about the transport sector, which is a key sector when it comes to climate change or fossil fuel emissions? Again, what you see here is that over time, we expect to see much more biomass-based fuels in the world, in particular in the global south, and higher shares of electricity, again, in particular in the global south. So again, it seems that the world will need to rely a lot on what happens in the global south. So we have to discuss who's going to pay for that, if the global south is going to pay the full bill, or we have to find a way to share that burden among the different countries. Same issue with respect to industry. I'm not going to go into details here, but again, in the case of industry, the global south will decarbonize the most. We rely more on electricity. We rely more on renewable energy, et cetera, again, showing the importance of the global south. Again, too much detail here. Latin America, we see when we compare Latin America with our regions, the transport sector, more biofuels, more electricity. Again, I'm repeating myself. Okay, this is when it comes to least cost solution to find a global problem. But what about other possible approaches to share the burden that's not exactly a least cost solution? So there's literature available these days discussing different possibilities here. And basically there are 4 different schemes that have been discussed the most on how to share the burden of fighting climate change. One is called grandfathering. This grandfathering basically is based on the equity principle of sovereignty, meaning that, let's say, acquired rights of nations justified by established custom and uses. So basically, let's say, the criteria to allocate future emissions would be proportional to the current emission shares. This is mostly the view of the global north. Okay, we emit more, we have done things wrong, sorry, but we're not going to do much. This is one possibility and is being discussed and is being done. The other possibility is what we call per capita convergence, meaning that, let's say, we're talking about sovereignty, but also the issue of equality. Meaning that, let's say, the criteria to allocate future emissions will converge over time to being proportional to population share. So basically, in the future, in this convergence, each inhabitant of this planet would have the right, to emit the same amount of carbon emissions per year, meaning that the global south will have the right to increase emissions, and the global north will need to reduce emissions so that they will converge to the same level. Then another possibility is ability to pay. Ability to pay, okay, your, let's say, emission will be a function of what's your GDP per capita. Let's say richer nations will have to bear more efforts, poorer nations will have the right to do less. Another possibility here. And finally, I'm not going to go into details here, this greenhouse development rights, where not only we're looking at the ability to pay, but also income inequalities, even within individual nations, to try to compensate for inequalities in individual nations. What's the result of that? Using the example of Latin America. So we can see here in red, what would be, let's say, the profile of CO2 emissions over time in a least cost approach. So by definition, the least cost is cheaper, meaning that you're going to need net zero earlier, but then you're going to need to have much higher levels of negative emissions later on. Why you're going to have more negative emissions later on? Because in this least cost approach, developed nations do most of the job in the beginning, and developed nations do not do much. And then you have to compensate for what they have emitted more. And then we see that depending upon which approach we're talking about, net zero is going to be reached later on. So again, a decision what to do. Let's go for least cost solution, meaning that global south, we have to do more, or let's discuss different possibilities to allocate the burden. So here we see, let's say, what is the different carbon budgets for Latin America, depending upon which burden sharing scheme we're talking about. So by definition, the red line here, which is the least cost solution, is what gives the least or the smaller carbon budget for Latin America, because Latin America will have to do more to compensate for high emissions in other regions. The other burden sharing schemes would be better for Latin America because they would have more space, let's say, to emit, because part of the effort will come from the global north and not from the global south. Okay. This is the idea here. And what are the results of this analysis I'm trying to show you here? So basically what we see here is that depending upon which criteria you're talking about, let's say the burden or the carbon budget for the different regions change dramatically depending upon what scheme you're talking about. So you see here, let's say in red is the least cost solution, where Latin America has a very small burden share, China is small, India is small, Africa is small, Europe not so small, US not so small. If you move to other burden sharing schemes, you see that all developing nations get more space to emit CO2, and developed nations get less space, which is exactly the spirit here. Let's say, because we have a limit budget, if someone emits less, someone will have the right to emit more. But again, let's say, who is going to pay for this different allocation? Okay, almost done here. So we see, let's say, a significant variance in the different equity criteria, depending upon which criteria we are talking about. Let's say stricter restrictions for the US. Let's say, basically we have, let's say, all equity criteria impose further limitations on emissions from the US. Higher emissions in India and Africa in the case of, let's say, these different burden schemes, and we see some flexibility for China and Latin America. If you look at the share of renewables in the globe, depending upon the different burden sharing schemes, as expected, we see more renewables, let's say, in the least cost solution, because you do something for, let's say, earlier, and you do not need to rely so much on negative emissions later on. If you basically, let's say, use different burden sharing schemes, less renewables, meaning that you have to do something else later, or use much more expensive technology like CDR, carbon dioxide removal, direct air capture, because if you do not use the opportunity for more renewables, which are mostly present in developing countries, you're going to need to rely later on more expensive technologies, and that's why it's more expensive not to go through the least cost. What about BECCS, biomass with energy, biomass with carbon capture and storage, and just a picture of 2050. We see that in the least cost solution, we are not going to need much BECCS because we're doing a lot of renewables and using a lot of opportunities besides BECCS. If you go to the other burden share scheme, you're going to need to rely much more on BECCS to compensate for the heavy reliance on fossil fuels, which we will continue to depend if you do not go for the least cost solution. What about crude oil production? I think this is a very interesting figure here. Let's concentrate on the figure below here. Basically, what I'm showing here is what a deviation for oil production in different regions of the world if you're not in the least cost solution. So if you're not in the least cost solution, Africa, you have the right to produce much more oil. Latin America, you have the right to produce much more oil. Same Asia Pacific. And then Europe, US, you have to produce much less fossil fuels. And that's why it's easy to understand why the least cost solution is the best solution, because it's least cost, but have implications for developing nations that eventually want to rely on fossil fuels to promote their development. So what we can conclude from all of this, let's say, basically, our study demonstrates that different effort sharing approach result in less stringent budgets compared to cost optimal budgets, revealing potential for inequalities for Latin America under cost optimal approaches. About fairness consideration, our findings indicate that outcomes derived from cost optimal approaches may not be deemed fair by all nations, emphasizing the need for more equitable solutions in future carbon budget allocations. What about shaping future energy transitions? This result is important to help policymakers like Ramón in Latin America and elsewhere to think about future directions of the energy transition they are aiming for in the regions. So to end here, basically, I want to congratulate Dr. Galain for the Carnot Prize you're receiving today. Congratulations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. That was a fitting conclusion to our ceremony today. Really wonderful, wonderful remarks. We'll get to a lucky few of us will be able to continue that conversation at dinner. For the rest of us, we'll share a fantastic reception downstairs. I would be remiss if I did not end by thanking the amazing members of the Kleinman Center staff who have been working, I just have to share, nonstop for the last several weeks, making sure that this event was appropriately perfect for the recipient and his wonderful family in this week. So thank you all, Bill, Molly, Ken, Corey. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Eight consecutive Carnot Prizes without a single rebellion that we'll never have another one after all the effort it takes. So thank you so much. I would like to extend my own personal thanks once again to the recipient, Ramón, not least for allowing me to spend some time with your lovely family today. It was wonderful. Again, thank you to Scott Kleinman for making all of this and so much more possible. To our deans in attendance, thank you. To our lecturer as well, and to President Liz McGill, who is forging ahead with another impossible job, just like the one you had as the president of a wonderful university and as it meets the world's great challenges. And thank you all for attending. I think this is probably the biggest crowd, in-person crowd we've had since pre-pandemic, and it's wonderful to see you all here today. So thank you.